Hey everyone, Scott here. I have a special announcement before we begin this episode. I'm doing a 5-part series on the Middle Ages, and I make the argument that the so-called Dark Ages really weren't that dark. No one thought the Earth was flat. Many things were invented like clocks, windmills, and even flying machines. Universities were built, philosophy spread, and even the bad stuff that we associate with the Middle Ages, like witch burnings, happened in the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment. The reason I'm doing this series is because I'm also releasing a book that I just finished on the same subject. It's called The Age of Illumination: Science, Technology, and Reason in the Middle Ages. It covers all the things I'm going to mention in this podcast series, but goes into way more detail. The book is now available on Amazon in ebook and paperback form. The ebook is only $2.99, and you can find it by going to Amazon and search for The Age of Illumination and Scott Rank. So if you like this podcast, I think you'll really like the book. I get way into the details of the Middle Ages and try to make the story as interesting as possible. So please go check it out on Amazon, and if you like the book, please leave a review as well. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on counterintuitive facts about the Middle Ages. In this episode, we're going to be talking about two things that people probably don't associate with the medieval period. The first is technology and technological advancement, and how technology actually moved forward significantly in the Middle Ages. And many people think that there was really no progress from about 500 to 1500, but we're going to see that that's not true. The second thing we're going to look at is leisure. People took a lot of time off in the Middle Ages. It's not as if everyone who wasn't a king was working as hard as a plantation slave in antebellum America. In fact, your average peasant took off way more time than the typical American worker or worker in the Western world today. So a typical peasant had way more leisure time than we do now. First, let's talk about medieval technology, because there are inventions that appear centuries before you would ever think they would show up. I first got clued into this when I was in my master's program and I wrote a 50-page research paper on clocks in the Ottoman Empire. And if that sounds grueling, then don't go to a master's program, because that's the type of stuff that you're in for. And if your response to me saying that isn't, wow, that sounds interesting, but why would anyone do that? Then there you go. Anyway, when I was reading sources about the early clocks, there was a question that people had. Sort of a chicken and the egg question of, did people build clocks because they needed to keep track of time? Or did people start keeping track of time because there were clocks around? The reason this question is tricky is because early clocks were not terribly accurate and they had to be reset frequently. So the question is, why even bother having clocks around if they're not going to be accurate? That's the point of a timepiece, isn't it? It's like having a ruler whose measurements are off. If your tool of measurement isn't accurately measuring, then what's it supposed to do? Well, this question isn't resolved, but one point overlooked in this whole discussion is how mechanically complicated clocks had to be. Your calibration has to be very accurate in a clock so that it doesn't become inaccurate. Your margin of error is almost infinitesimal. Even if you're off a few seconds in a day, that adds up so quickly that soon the timepiece isn't accurate. And imagine trying to make a precision timekeeping device when you don't have precision instruments and you have to make tiny gears. You have to come up with all sorts of inventions like eyeglasses, magnifying glasses, and other tools to get down in there. Well, inventors did come up with precision tools, and inventors and clockmakers were able to make extraordinary devices. So much so that you see clocks appear in the Middle Ages that are so precise they can handle calculations that go on for days, weeks, months, years, and even centuries, and not just handle the time of day, but be able to calculate planetary motion and see where the planets are in our solar system at any given time. And you basically have a mainframe computer being built all the way back in the Middle Ages. So clocks were my entry point into this, and I want to tell one more story about a clock before we dive more deeply into what technological advancement looked like in the Middle Ages. We're going all the way back to the year 807. We're coming back to our favorite stock figure that always shows up in a discussion of the Middle Ages, and that is Charlemagne. So in this year, Charlemagne received an embassy from Harun al-Rashid, who is the caliph of the Abbasid Empire, centered in Baghdad. The Abbasids were probably one of, if not the most powerful state in the world west of China, and the discussion with Charlemagne was to go over the possibility of a military alliance. Harun al-Rashid wanted a military alliance against the Byzantine Empire that was on his north and a breakaway Muslim state in Spain. The Umayyad family that had run the Islamic Caliphate before the Abbasid dynasty took control in Spain, and Harun al-Rashid wanted to take it back and figured Charlemagne would be a useful ally. When the embassy arrived in Charlemagne's court, Harun sent numerous presents to him, partly to butter him up for an alliance, but with any giving of gifts, you also want to show off your technological superiority. So these gifts included scents and fabrics and a chessboard. Famously, there was an elephant named Abu Abbas, and we have all sorts of tapestries and pictures of this elephant showing up in a chronicle. But the most astounding of all was an automatic water clock. It was made of brass and marked the 12 hours with balls of brass that fell on a plate every hour and had 12 horsemen who appeared in turn precisely at each hour and closed the previous window. According to the Royal Frankish Annals, the Frankish Chronicle, there were other features on the clock that were too numerous to mention. And this mechanical clock predates the appearance of similar mechanical clocks in medieval towns and villages by at least 6 centuries, because at this time in Europe, the only other clocks were primitive sundials and sand clocks and the occasional water clock, but that definitely lacked the sophistication of the Abbasid contraption. So this is perhaps the first mention of a mechanical clock in any medieval source. The clock's design was based in part on Greek and Roman models from antiquity, because technology to create such things had been lost. But in the coming centuries, the greatest minds of medieval Europe used these few scraps of reference and innovated by using whatever sources they could recover, but also using completely new ways of thinking. So this combination of innovation and historical precedent led to a surprising number of technological innovations. Charlemagne's clock may have been a catalyst for the development of technology in the Middle Ages. We don't know how well this thing was known. Yes, it was in the Frankish Chronicles, don't know how many people read them. And until the 11th century, clocks were rare. They usually employed water weight and were used in monasteries, where timekeeping was important because you would have a fairly rigid schedule where there would be prayers of the hours. These prayers would occur at night, so you couldn't use environmental conditions like the sun to know the time. But if we just jump ahead a few centuries, by 1320, there are so many references to clocks in different sources that it's safe to say most medieval villages had one. And many of these clocks were built with an incredible amount of structural integrity and could last the test of time. The clock in Salisbury Cathedral, which was built in 1386, still keeps time today. And it wasn't just timekeeping devices that appear. Another important device was the astrolabe. The astrolabe was an early model of the solar system that was driven partly by interest in astrology, but this eventually inspired the scientific pursuit of true astronomy. In addition to water clocks, water inspired other technological innovations in the Middle Ages. Mills used water pressure to crush and extract ore, as well as process grain. And there were other developments in water-related vessels. By 1300, ships were multi-masted and featured a stern-post-mounted rudder, and navigation was carried out by means of a new dry compass. These innovations are what ignited the age of exploration, which paved the way for the eventual circumnavigation of the globe. So what kicked off this period of innovation? Partly it had to do with research that was taking place at monasteries, and we're going to see in a second where one of the first flying machines we have record of was made at a monastery, but it also has to do with economics and the shortage of labor. In the middle of the 14th century, there was a famine that spread throughout England and Europe. And then, of course, there was the Black Plague, which we talked about in a previous episode, that killed up to a third of Europe. This shortage of people led to all sorts of different social developments, including standing armies rather than groups of noblemen relying on a steady population of feudal vassals. This in turn led to increased amounts of siege warfare, which necessitated all sorts of military innovations. The trebuchet in the 11th century was the largest long-range siege weapon used, and we see this in the Crusades. But by 1324, the invention of artillery using gunpowder-driven cannons rendered castles obsolete. During the 100 Years' War, the English perfected the longbow, which diminished the usefulness of armor, since volleys could be released quickly and their powerful projectile force pierced armor. And since the time of Charlemagne, mounted cavalry had seen constant innovation, including the stirrup, the horseshoe, and the spur, which allowed soldiers to fight without dismounting, ride farther and longer through varied terrain, and have more control over their animals during battle. This is one of the easiest mistakes to identify in any historical epic film that takes place in the Roman era or the Middle Ages. Anything before the High Middle Ages that has a stirrup is wrong because stirrups didn't exist. And I'm not bothered about this mistake because almost nobody knows that. And if you're going to film Gladiator set during the Roman Empire, you can't have hundreds of extras on horseback without stirrups. It's going to make it a lot harder. Filming will be more difficult. No one will really even notice. But if you want to nitpick films better, there's a little bit of info for you. When it comes to medieval technology, somebody that you can't overlook, but sadly has been mostly forgotten, is Aylmer of Malmesbury. He was a monk who invented a flying machine in the 11th century. If we think of pre-Wright Brothers era flight, a lot of people think of Leonardo da Vinci with his illustrations and drawings, and imagining that he was successfully flying in Italy. But Da Vinci only made drawings, and it was a nice drawing, but his design would have never flown, and it would have dropped like a rock. Aylmer of Malmesbury built what we can think of as a vest or a glider. Aylmer was a monk of Malmesbury Abbey in England, and was known to have written on astrology. The only thing we know about his life is a mention of him in the chronicle Gesta Regum Angelorum, or Deeds of the English Kings. It was written by the medieval historian William of Malmesbury in 1125. He was a monk in the same abbey as Aylmer, and he likely obtained his account from contemporaries of him. William records that in Aylmer's youth, he read the Greek fable of Daedalus and wanted to reproduce this flying feat. And also, flying wasn't fantasy to medieval technical enthusiasts. Craftsmen developed small drawstring toy helicopters, windmills, and sophisticated sails for boats. Church artists depict angels with increasingly accurate depictions of bird-like wings, and they detailed their curvature that would have been necessary to generate sufficient lift for a bird or an airplane to fly. These projects culminated into general acceptance that some sort of contraption could obtain temporary flight through physical effort and human reason. With all this knowledge in tow, Aylmer developed his glider, and he dragged it to the top of a tower at Malmesbury Abbey to test his theories. We don't know what was going on in the monk's mind, but he was probably thinking of theological principles as much as physics principles. Maybe he had doubts as to whether mortal flesh could actually fly due to the weight of sin. Because in the Middle Ages, the line between spiritual and material was very porous. So he took his contraption to the top of the abbey, stepped off, and took flight. Here's what we have of Aylmer's flight in the chronicle about him. He was a man learned for those times, of ripe old age, and in his early youth had hazarded a deed of remarkable boldness. He had by some means, I scarcely know what, fastened wings to his hands and feet, so that, mistaking fable for truth, he might fly like Daedalus, and, collecting the breeze upon the summit of a tower, flew for more than a furlong, which is 200 meters or 220 yards. But, agitated by the violence of the wind and the swirling of air, as well as by the awareness of his rash attempt, he fell, broke both his legs, and was lame forever. He used, to relate as the cause of his failure, his forgetting to provide himself a tail. So the design of Aylmer's apparatus would have resembled something like a bird if he had in fact managed to glide downward against the breeze by utilizing gravity and the wind. But since he didn't attach a tail to his device, he would have been unable to balance himself forward and backwards, as a bird does by slight movements of its wings. So his apparatus didn't allow him to achieve true soaring height, but a tail would have allowed him to glide down in safety. So the total length of his flight was 2.5 football fields long. Given that he flew for more than a furlong, meant that he would have been airborne for approximately 15 seconds. The exact flight path isn't known because the abbey in which he flew is larger than its 11th century counterpart. But he presumably flew over many buildings because Oliver's Lane, which is off the present-day High Street and approximately 200 meters from the abbey, is where Alamer landed. The story of his flight was told and retold